In the summer of 1988, a 22-year-old man told police exactly where to find 4 murder victims using a deck of playing cards. What they discovered would make hardened detectives question whether evil itself could take human form. There are crimes that shock a nation, and then there are crimes so depraved they seem to exist beyond the boundaries of human comprehension. In the annals of British criminal history, fewer than 70 individuals have committed acts so heinous they've been condemned to die behind bars. Recipients of whole life sentences with no possibility of parole ever. While household names like Harold Shipman and Rose West dominate headlines, lurking in the shadows of infamy are killers whose brutality matches or exceeds the notorious, yet whose names have faded from public memory. This deliberate obscurity might be the cruelest punishment of all for someone who killed specifically to achieve immortal notoriety. Anthony Arkwright represents everything terrifying about the intersection of childhood trauma and psychopathic ambition. His story isn't just about murder. It's about a calculated campaign to join the ranks of history's most feared killers, executed with a level of sadistic creativity that defies comprehension. Born in 1967 in the fading industrial landscape of South Yorkshire, Arkwright's early years read like a textbook case study in criminal development. Wath-upon-Dearne was a mining town caught in the death spiral of Britain's declining coal industry, a place where poverty and desperation had settled like soot in the air. When Anthony was barely old enough to form memories, his mother simply walked away. She abandoned 5 children to a father whose life revolved around 12-hour shifts underground, a man whose hands were permanently stained with coal dust, and whose capacity for nurturing had been buried as deep as the mines he worked. The care system of 1970s Britain wasn't equipped to handle damaged children, and Anthony pinballed between institutions that were more concerned with containment than healing. Each placement failure added another layer to his growing resentment against a world that had rejected him before he'd even learned to read. By adolescence, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Anthony had evolved into exactly what the system feared most: a young predator who viewed violence as communication and chaos as entertainment. School expelled him for behaviors that went far beyond typical teenage rebellion. This wasn't mischief, it was reconnaissance for a criminal career. The Borstal, Britain's euphemism for youth prison, became Anthony's finishing school. But instead of rehabilitation, these institutions provided him with criminal connections and, more dangerously, access to a library that would reshape his ambitions entirely. It was behind bars that Anthony Arkwright discovered his true calling. While other inmates focused on petty crime and survival, Anthony immersed himself in the mythology of serial murder. He devoured every available book about Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper who had terrorized the North just a few years earlier. He studied Jack the Ripper with the dedication of a scholar, analyzing techniques and savoring the lasting fear these men had created. But this wasn't academic curiosity. It was career planning. Anthony began telling anyone who would listen that he intended to surpass these killers in both brutality and fame. He wasn't content to be forgotten like common criminals. He wanted his name whispered in the same breath as history's most notorious monsters. By 1988, the 21-year-old Arkwright had been released into a world that offered him nothing. The mining industry that had sustained Wath upon Dern for generations was collapsing, leaving behind a landscape of boarded shops and broken dreams. He moved into his father's council flat on Denham Road, an address that would soon become synonymous with unthinkable horror. His job at the local scrapyard was meant to provide structure, but Anthony viewed employment as an inconvenience that interfered with his real interests, petty crime and elaborate fantasies of murder. His work ethic was non-existent, his attitude poisonous. It was only a matter of time before even this bottom-tier opportunity would be stripped away. Living on Denham Road brought Anthony into contact with the kind of vulnerable people who populate the margins of society, exactly the sort of victims he'd been fantasizing about for years. Marcus Law lived in a specially adapted bungalow, his world confined to a wheelchair and limited by disability benefits that barely covered basic necessities. To Anthony, Marcus represented everything he despised about weakness and dependency. Their relationship had devolved into a series of petty conflicts, usually over borrowed cigarettes that Marcus could ill afford to give and Anthony felt entitled to take. Raymond Ford presented a different kind of target. Once a respected teacher, Ford had descended into alcoholism and depression so severe that he rarely left his flat. His world had contracted to 4 walls, bottles of cheap cider, and a television that provided the only light in his increasingly dark existence. Anthony saw both men as practice subjects, humans so isolated from society that their deaths might go unnoticed for days or even weeks. The catalyst came on August 26, 1988, when the inevitable finally occurred. Anthony was fired from the scrapyard. His boss had tolerated months of tardiness, absenteeism, and attitude problems, but even charity has limits. With his final paycheck burning a hole in his pocket, Anthony headed straight to the nearest pub. Alcohol has a way of dissolving the thin barriers that separate fantasy from action, and Anthony had been nurturing violent fantasies for years. But the dismissal from work wasn't the only pressure building in his fevered mind. Days earlier, he'd burglarized Raymond Ford's flat, stealing items of minimal value but maximum symbolic importance. A clock that marked time Ford barely noticed, and a light fitting from a home that had grown increasingly dark. When Ford confronted him about the theft and threatened police involvement, Anthony found himself facing imminent arrest. The prospect of returning to prison should have deterred him, but Anthony's mind worked differently than most. Instead of seeing consequences, he saw opportunity. If he was going to be arrested anyway, why not make it worthwhile? Why not finally achieve the notoriety he'd been craving since his days in the prison library? There was also another factor gnawing at him, a persistent rumor about his parentage that had haunted him since childhood. Whispers suggested his birth resulted from an incestuous relationship between his mother and grandfather, a piece of family mythology that had become an obsession. Whether true or false hardly mattered. The shame and rage it generated were real enough to fuel violence. Drunk, unemployed, facing arrest, and consumed by decades of accumulated resentment, Anthony Arkwright finally decided to make his mark on history. His grandfather, Startsis Pokius, was tending to his allotment garden in nearby Mexborough when Anthony appeared. The old man, probably relieved to see his grandson, rose to greet him with the kind of warmth that Anthony had never learned to recognize or reciprocate. Anthony's response was immediate and brutal. He drove a knife into his grandfather's neck with such force that the blade severed the spinal cord, dropping the elderly man like a felled tree. Paralyzed but still conscious, Startsis could only watch as his grandson dragged him into the garden shed. What happened next in that potting shed reveals the depth of Anthony's planned sadism. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. It was a deliberate torture session designed to maximize suffering. Anthony grabbed a garden axe and buried it deep in his grandfather's chest before finishing the job with a mallet, methodically destroying the skull of the man who had probably shown him more kindness than anyone else in his life. From there, Anthony allegedly moved to his grandfather's house, where he encountered Elsa Conrads, the housekeeper. The details of her death mirror his grandfather's. Repeated blows with an axe, delivered with the kind of sustained fury that speaks to something far darker than mere anger. But here's where Anthony's true nature reveals itself. Instead of fleeing or hiding, he went drinking. He visited pub after pub around Mexborough, chatting with friends and neighbors of his grandfather while their blood was still drying under his fingernails. Witnesses later described his behavior as electric, almost manic. He seemed to be riding a high that no amount of alcohol could diminish. He dropped hints that should have alarmed anyone paying attention. "It's been murder on the allotment today," he told one person. To another, he made an even more chilling prediction. "I'll see you in 25 years. I've just done 2 murders." These weren't slips of the tongue. They were calculated reveals designed to build anticipation for what he had planned next. Anthony wanted witnesses to remember these moments, wanted them to realize later that they had been in the presence of a killer who was just getting started. Around 3 a.m. he stumbled back to Denham Road, but his night of violence was far from over. The sight of Raymond Ford's flat seems to have triggered the rage he'd been nursing about the burglary accusation. Here was the man who had dared to threaten him with police involvement, who had treated him like a common criminal instead of the mastermind he believed himself to be. Anthony retrieved something from his flat that reveals the theatrical nature of his psychosis. A plastic devil mask. He slipped it over his head, transforming himself into the visual embodiment of evil, and entered Ford's home through the same broken window he'd used for the burglary. Once inside, Anthony stripped naked, keeping only the devil mask. The symbolism was deliberate. He wanted Raymond Ford's final vision to be of Satan himself, standing naked in his living room. What followed was torture masquerading as murder. Raymond Ford, probably awakening from an alcohol-induced stupor to find a naked, masked figure looming over him, became the subject of Anthony's most prolonged and sadistic experiment in human suffering. 500 stab wounds. Let that number sink in for a moment. This wasn't killing. It was surgical destruction carried out with methodical precision over what must have been hours. 11 ribs snapped under the assault. At one point, Anthony was stabbing with such violence that his knife blade snapped off in Ford's body, forcing him to retrieve another weapon to continue his work. The devil mask served a dual purpose during this marathon of violence. According to later reports, Anthony had been terrorizing Ford for days before the murder, appearing at his window wearing the mask. Ford, already weakened by depression and alcohol, had been living in fear of this demonic figure. Now, in his final moments, that nightmare had become terrifyingly real. When Ford finally died, probably from blood loss rather than any single wound, Anthony calmly returned home, showered off the evidence of his night's work, and went to sleep. The next morning brought an almost surreal moment of near justice. Police arrived at Anthony's door to arrest him, but not for murder. They had come about the burglary complaint Raymond Ford had filed days earlier. As they led Anthony away for questioning, they had no idea they were handling a man whose hands had been inside another human being's chest cavity just hours before. Even more incredibly, after a few hours of routine questioning about stolen goods, they released him on bail. Anthony Arkwright walked out of that police station knowing he had literally gotten away with murder, at least temporarily. That evening, emboldened by his apparent invincibility, Anthony went drinking again. The psychological rush of killing, combined with the thrill of having fooled the police, seems to have convinced him that he was untouchable. By the early hours of the next morning, he was ready to kill again. Marcus Law, the wheelchair-bound neighbor who had been the source of petty irritation over borrowed cigarettes, became Anthony's next canvas for violence. Like Raymond Ford, Marcus was subjected to prolonged torture, more than 70 stab wounds inflicted over what was probably hours of systematic brutality. But Anthony wasn't content with simple murder. He had developed a signature style, a way of marking his work that would ensure maximum psychological impact on whoever discovered the bodies. Marcus Law's eyes were gouged from their sockets and replaced with cigarettes, a grotesque commentary on their disputes over tobacco. More cigarettes were stuffed into his ears and nostrils, while others were arranged in the shape of a crucifix on his chest. Anthony had turned his victim into a macabre religious display. The final indignity was reserved for Marcus's abdomen. Anthony hacked it open and shoved one of Marcus's own crutches deep into the wound, a violating gesture that transformed an mobility aid into an instrument of degradation. By now, Anthony was becoming frustrated that his masterpieces weren't receiving proper attention. Days had passed and no one had discovered the bodies. This wasn't how his fantasies had played out. He needed witnesses, needed the world to see what he was capable of creating. So he decided to orchestrate his own reveal. When he encountered Marcus Law's mother on the street, Anthony delivered a performance worthy of any stage. "Sorry about poor Marcus," he told her with mock sympathy. "He's killed himself." Mrs. Law, naturally concerned, rushed to her son's adapted bungalow and let herself in. The sight that greeted her was designed specifically to maximize psychological trauma. Her disabled son, butchered and arranged like some hellish artwork, with cigarettes protruding from where his eyes should have been. Anthony had achieved exactly what he wanted. A witness who would carry the image of his work forever. Someone whose screams would alert the world to his capabilities. This time, when police arrested Anthony Arkwright, they knew they were dealing with something unprecedented. But Anthony wasn't about to make their job easy. He was finally getting the attention he'd craved for years, and he intended to savor every moment. During interrogation, he refused to give straight answers, instead claiming to possess psychic abilities. He produced a deck of playing cards and began reading them like tarot, turning the interview room into his personal theater. When he drew the Four of Hearts, Anthony delivered his masterstroke. "This is the Master card," he announced. "This means you have 4 bodies and a madman on the loose. You've found one, but there are 3 more. I can see Marcus Law, but the others are indescribable. They are just too horrible to describe. The psychological game was masterful. Anthony had confirmed Marcus Law's murder while tantalizing police with the promise of more bodies. He was controlling the investigation's pace, parceling out information to maximize his time in the spotlight. When police searched his flat, they discovered an arsenal that revealed the premeditated nature of his crimes. Knives, clubs, and homemade flails, weapons designed specifically for torture rather than quick killing. Despite knowing that Raymond Ford was missing and seeing his broken window, police initially failed to enter his flat. They knocked on his door, noted the obvious signs of disturbance, but somehow failed to investigate further. For 2 more days, Raymond Ford's butchered remains lay undiscovered while Anthony savored the knowledge that his masterpiece was waiting to be found. When officers finally entered Ford's flat, the scene that greeted them redefined their understanding of human cruelty. The living room had been transformed into an abattoir, with Ford's entrails strung around the room like macabre decorations. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, the officers realized that the dark objects they had stepped over in the hallway weren't discarded trash. They were Raymond Ford's internal organs, methodically removed and scattered like a trail of breadcrumbs, leading to the main display. One officer would later say that Anthony had removed practically every internal organ in his body, turning the flat into a museum of human anatomy spread across multiple rooms. With 2 bodies found, police knew they needed to locate the remaining victims Anthony had promised. It took 2 more days before they discovered Startsis Pocius and Elsa Conrads, and only because they decided to check with Anthony's grandfather about his recent movements. But Anthony wasn't finished playing games. He told investigators about a 5th body submerged in a nearby lake, sending search teams on a wild goose chase that consumed days of resources and manpower. There was no 5th body. It was simply another way for Anthony to extend his moment in the spotlight. When Anthony Arkwright finally appeared in court, he had achieved everything he'd dreamed of during those long nights in the prison library. Photographers captured his image, crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the monster, and his name appeared in headlines across the country. He dressed for the occasion like a punk rock star, spiked hair, leather jacket, and a red bow tie that suggested this was entertainment rather than justice. He posed for cameras, smoking cigarettes and laughing at the outraged crowds who had come to witness his moment of infamy. During the trial, Anthony admitted to murdering his grandfather, Raymond Ford, and Marcus Law. But in a final gesture of control, he denied killing Elsa Conrads. He admitted to standing over her body with an axe, but maintained his innocence regarding her actual death. This wasn't a legal strategy, it was psychological manipulation. By withholding this one confession, Anthony ensured that questions would linger, that his case would remain slightly unsolved, incomplete. Even in conviction, he found a way to maintain some power over the narrative. Justice Borum, in sentencing Anthony to whole life imprisonment, delivered words that capture the essence of this case. I accept that you have had a deprived and disturbed childhood, but that cannot be any excuse for the appalling cruelty and apparent sadistic pleasure with which you carried out these offenses. The judge recognized what made Anthony Arkwright uniquely dangerous, not just his capacity for violence, but his evident enjoyment of inflicting suffering. This wasn't about money or revenge or even psychological compulsion. This was about pleasure derived from human agony, calculated to achieve maximum effect. Detective Inspector Bob Meek, who worked the case, perhaps put it best. From the day we brought him in to the day he was jailed, Arkwright seemed genuinely proud of what he had done. He expected everyone to revere him, to be fascinated by him. He was a messed-up kid desperate for attention. In his defective mind, he chose murder to get the attention he craved. But here lies the ultimate irony of Anthony Arkwright's story. He killed to achieve immortality, to join the pantheon of killers whose names echo through history. He wanted to be remembered alongside Jack the Ripper and Peter Sutcliffe, wanted mothers to whisper his name to frighten children into obedience. Instead, he achieved something far more fitting: obscurity. Within years of his sentencing, Anthony Arkwright's name had faded from public consciousness. His victims are remembered by those who loved them, but their killer has been relegated to footnotes in criminology textbooks and obscure true crime discussions. Anthony Arkwright sits in a cell today, no longer young, no longer commanding attention. He achieved his goal of never being released. He will die behind bars, but not because of his notoriety. He'll die forgotten, just another entry in the prison system's database. Perhaps this is the most appropriate punishment for someone who killed specifically to be remembered, to be deliberately forgotten. Anthony Arkwright wanted his name written in history's darkest chapters, but instead it's being erased by the simple passage of time and society's conscious decision to deny him the fame he murdered to achieve. In seeking immortality through infamy, he found something much worse than death: irrelevance. And in a cell somewhere in Britain today, a 56-year-old man sits with the knowledge that his life's greatest ambition was not just a failure, but a complete waste of 4 innocent lives and his own existence. The Rotherham Ripper never made it into the history books, and that might be the most fitting justice of all.